Imagine you're running the world's largest economy. You've got China tightening its grip on global supply chains, the United States playing geopolitical chess, and Europe slowly drowning in energy debt. You need a new partner, a stable one, a big one, someone with 270 million people sitting on top of the world's largest nickel reserves, straddling the most important shipping lane on the planet. You need Indonesia. And here's the crazy part. Most people in the West still think of Bali when they hear that name. Meanwhile, Jakarta's finance ministers are signing deals that will reshape how the entire global economy works. So why isn't anyone talking about this? Who's already moved in quietly? And what happens to the rest of Southeast Asia when the sleeping giant finally, fully wakes up? Stay with me, because this story is just getting started. To understand what's happening in Indonesia right now, you need to go back to 1997, the Asian financial crisis. The IMF comes in, the rupiah collapses, losing 80% of its value in months, and President Suharto, who'd ruled for 31 years, is gone within a year. The country looked finished. Economists were writing its obituary. But here's the thing about Indonesia that most analysts missed. It didn't actually break, it bent. Badly, but it didn't break. Over the next 2 decades, it quietly rebuilt. It democratized. It decentralized. It grew a middle class of over 52 million people, with another 150 million on the cusp. By 2010, it had joined the G20. By 2023, it was hosting the G20. The key players shaping this story today are President Prabowo Subianto, who took office in late 2024, promising to continue the infrastructure-first legacy of his predecessor Jokowi Widodo, known simply as Jokowi, and a generation of technocrats who studied in the West, came home, and decided to play the long game. There were warning signs, of course, or rather warning signs that this was working, that nobody took seriously enough. But here's where it gets interesting. It's January 2020. Indonesia bans the export of raw nickel ore. Just bans it. Cold turkey. The EU immediately files a complaint with the World Trade Organization. The price of nickel globally jolts upward, and Western analysts write pieces with headlines like Indonesia's self-destructive protectionism. They were completely wrong. Here's what Jokowi understood that the critics didn't. Indonesia sits on roughly 22% of the world's known nickel reserves. Nickel is the critical ingredient in lithium-ion batteries. Electric vehicles need it. The entire green energy transition needs it. And for decades, Indonesia had been shipping raw ore to China, which would process it, add the value, and sell it back to the world at a markup. Jokowi looked at that arrangement and said, not anymore. The result? In just 3 years, Indonesia's processed nickel and stainless steel exports went from roughly $3.3 billion annually to over $33 billion. That's a 10x increase in export value from a single policy decision. Let's put that in perspective. That's more than the entire GDP of Iceland, generated from one commodity in 3 years because Indonesia decided to do the processing itself. China, initially furious, adapted. It moved its smelting operations into Indonesia, bringing capital, technology, and jobs with it. Indonesia got the investment it wanted. China got access to the ore it needed, and Indonesia kept the value-added revenue. The EU lost the WTO case in 2022, by the way. Indonesia didn't blink. This is the canary in the coal mine for how emerging markets are going to play the commodity game in the 21st century, and nickel is just chapter 1. Before we continue, if you've ever wondered why some countries seem to suddenly accelerate economically while others stagnate for decades, this next section is exactly why. Hit subscribe, because this pattern shows up again and again in economic history. Now back to Indonesia. When Jokowi came to power in 2014, Indonesia ranked 72nd globally in infrastructure quality. Roads were gridlocked. The islands, and there are over 17,000 of them, were barely connected. Moving goods from one part of the archipelago to another cost more per mile than shipping them from China to Rotterdam. So Jokowi did something simple. He spent heavily.
consistently for 10 years. Under his administration, Indonesia built over 1,900 kilometers of toll roads, 15 new airports, 24 new seaports, and began constructing an entirely new capital city, Nusantara, in Borneo. That last one sounds insane. And look, maybe it is a little, but the logic is real. Jakarta is sinking, literally. Parts of North Jakarta have subsided by up to 4 meters due to groundwater extraction. Moving the capital is expensive, but so is watching your seat of government slowly fall into the Java Sea. The infrastructure spending averaged around 3.3% of GDP annually for a decade. That's the South Korean playbook from the 1970s, the Malaysian playbook from the 1980s, and both of those countries became middle-income success stories within a generation. We're just getting started. In the next section, we get to the part where the global supply chain crisis handed Indonesia a gift it didn't even ask for.
It's 2022. Apple is staring at its supply chain and seeing a single point of failure: China. So is Samsung. So is every major manufacturer in the world. The pandemic exposed it. The US-China trade war accelerated it. And suddenly, the boardrooms of the world's largest companies are all asking the same question: who's next? This is the China Plus One strategy. Don't ditch China. You can't, it's too embedded. But build a parallel supply chain somewhere else. Vietnam got a lot of this early, but Vietnam has a population of 97 million and is running out of cheap labor. It's getting expensive fast. Indonesia has 270 million people, a median age of 29, and labor costs still significantly below regional competitors. Between 2021 and 2024, foreign direct investment into Indonesia's manufacturing sector surged. South Korea's Hyundai opened an EV manufacturing plant, their first outside South Korea, in Karawang, with a capacity of 150,000 vehicles per year. LG Energy Solution committed to a $9.8 billion battery complex. Apple began initial supplier diversification conversations. And in 2023, Indonesia signed a comprehensive partnership with the EU that specifically targeted critical mineral supply chains. Here's the kicker: Indonesia isn't just attracting manufacturing, it's attracting the upstream of manufacturing: the mining, the processing, the refining, the component production, the full stack. That's what separates this moment from, say, Bangladesh's garment boom, which was real but shallow. Indonesia is building industrial depth.
Now here's where the story takes a dark turn. Dark for Indonesia's competitors, that is. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, has a combined GDP of roughly $3.6 trillion. It's the 5th largest economy in the world if you treat it as a single bloc, and Indonesia, as ASEAN's largest member, is positioning itself as the bloc's de facto economic anchor. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, came into force in 2022. It's the world's largest trade agreement by GDP and population covered, linking ASEAN, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand in a single framework. Indonesia is sitting at the center of it, geographically and economically. Meanwhile, Jokowi's palm oil diplomacy, yes, palm oil is geopolitics now, built bilateral relationships across Africa and the Middle East that are starting to pay off in infrastructure investment, food security partnerships, and sovereign wealth fund deals. Before you sit back and think this all sounds great for Indonesia, what's the catch? Let me tell you about the catch in the next section, because there is always a catch.
Indonesia's growth story is real. The 4.9% GDP growth rate it has maintained through global inflation, pandemic shock, and geopolitical turbulence is genuinely impressive, especially when you compare it to 0.9% in Germany, 1.4% in France, or the outright contraction in some G7 economies during 2023. But the bull case and the bear case are both worth running. The bull case: demographics are extraordinary. 60% of the population is under 40. Digital adoption is among the fastest in the world. Indonesia has the 4th largest social media user base on the planet. The domestic consumer market is growing rapidly, and the commodity windfall from nickel, coal, palm oil, and copper is funding state capacity at exactly the right historical moment. The bear case: corruption remains a structural drag. Transparency International ranks Indonesia 115th out of 180 countries. Regulatory inconsistency has scared off some investors who came early and left frustrated. Income inequality, while slowly improving, means the growth isn't reaching everyone at the same speed. And the new capital, Nusantara, is already behind schedule and over budget, which, if it becomes a boondoggle, could drain political capital from more productive priorities. This is where Indonesia's next decade gets decided. Can the institutions
nations keep up with the ambition.
The moment that crystallized Indonesia's arrival on the global stage wasn't a single event. It was a sequence. G20 presidency in 2022, hosted with unexpected diplomatic competence during the Ukraine war, managing to get both Western nations and Russia and China in the same room. Then the nickel WTO ruling in its favor. Then the Hyundai and LG mega investments landing in the same quarter. Then the $20 billion Just Energy Transition Partnership, the largest climate finance deal ever signed with a developing country at the time, secured at COP27. In the span of about 18 months, Indonesia went from promising emerging market to indispensable player. The difference is subtle but enormous. Promising markets get talked about. Indispensable players get called. Who won? Indonesian exporters, domestic manufacturers, sovereign wealth fund managers, and, quietly, Chinese companies who moved operations inside Indonesian borders and are now partially insulated from Western sanctions risk. Who lost? Raw commodity exporters who thought Indonesia would stay in the low-value extraction game forever. They were wrong.
Now, before you sit back and think this is just an Indonesia story, it isn't. What Indonesia is doing with nickel, Congo is watching with cobalt. What Indonesia is doing with RCEP, India is attempting with its own trade architecture. The resource nationalism plus industrial policy plus demographic dividend playbook is being picked up across the global south. Whoever executes it best in the next decade will define the economic map of the 2040s. The parallel to Kazakhstan and the Silk Road moment is precise. Kazakhstan spent a decade looking like a petrostate with good PR. Then it quietly became the logistics backbone of Central Asian trade, the rare earth corridor between China and Europe, and a financial hub that nobody in New York took seriously until it was already functioning. Indonesia is doing the same thing, but bigger, much bigger. Watch what happens when Nusantara is operational. Watch the next round of battery supply chain announcements. Watch whether Indonesia joins BRICS. Active discussions are ongoing, and what that does to its geopolitical leverage. The global economic center of gravity is moving southeast, and it has been for years. Indonesia is one of the loudest signals.
3 things this story teaches us. First, resource wealth is only as valuable as the policy intelligence applied to it. Indonesia had nickel for generations. The ban on raw ore export turned it into a geopolitical weapon. The resource was always there. The strategy wasn't. Second, the hidden pattern most people miss is the compounding effect of infrastructure investment. It looks boring for years. Roads, ports, power grids, and then suddenly the economy has a structural capacity it didn't have before, and growth accelerates in a way that looks sudden but wasn't. Indonesia planted those seeds in 2014. We're watching them grow now. Third, and this one matters to you personally, the investment world is still pricing Indonesia as an emerging market risk, which means the gap between what it is and what the market thinks it is may be one of the larger mispricings of the current decade. That's not financial advice, but it is a pattern worth understanding.
Here's the question I'll leave you with. Every generation has 1 or 2 economies that go from peripheral to central in the span of 20 years. South Korea in the 70s, China in the 90s, Vietnam in the 2010s. The window to recognize it early, before the magazine covers, before the CNBC segments, before everyone already knows, is narrow. Indonesia's window is open right now. If this kind of deep dive economic storytelling is what you're here for, subscribe. I've got a video coming on Vietnam's semiconductor gamble and why it might be the most consequential industrial bet of the decade. And drop a comment. Do you think Indonesia becomes a top 5 global economy by 2050? Or does the corruption problem ultimately cap its ceiling? I genuinely want to know what you think.